So let's begin the session. So we have here Dr. Yes Jamnani, and who is a medical resident. And so as for the post, the topic we decided is pulmonary embolism. So yes, sir. Now sir will speak to you. Yes, sir.
Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss about pulmonary thromboembolism. And before we come on pulmonary thromboembolism, as we know, it is a part of venous thromboembolism. And in venous thromboembolism, when the idea of embolism comes, we should be aware that there is a possibility of embolism or thrombus in arterial circulation also. And same, there is a possibility of having it in the venous circulation also. And depending upon the site of its origin and going through the circulation, there's a possibility that it can stuck anywhere. So if we have a brief idea about arterial circulation and venous circulation, gives a possible idea that what are going to be the symptoms, and depending upon at what site thrombus has arrived arise, and at what site it is going to possibly get stuck into. So when it comes to arterial circulation, arterial circulation starts from left ventricle, and from left ventricle all the peripheral arteries go to the respective organs and respective peripheries. If any arterial thrombosis arise from anywhere from this side, be it atrial thrombi or in ventricle or from anywhere, it has the probability of getting stuck in the arterial circulation for sure, until unless exceptions of shunts are removed. So whether it gets stuck in splenic artery, for example, or cerebral artery, or be in any other peripheral artery, on the base of that particular site of ischemia, it is going to get particular symptoms. So this on the arterial side, because the source of origin is atria ventricle or a bigger chamber, and as soon as the branch is getting shortened, depending upon the size, the arterial thrombi will get stuck at. When it comes to venous thromboembolism, our our peripheral veins take the blood from the peripheries to the heart and ending up at the inferior vena cava, giving it to right atrium. So as we know, peripheral veins are small, narrow, and there are the possibilities of stresses are more. So they will be the source of origin of those thrombi or emboli. And as soon as they're going to get detached from here, as soon as they're going to climb up the pathway are going to get broader. Suppose it starts from leg veins, calf vein, or upper limb vein. As soon as they're going towards heart, the diameter of the venules or vessels or veins is getting broader and broader. So at particular roadmap, there are no going to get stuck until they reach heart. As soon as the venous circulation reach heart, that is our right atrium, which is receiving blood from superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. As soon as this right atrium receives blood, it gives the blood to right ventricle, which is having that possible thrombus, which is going to get stuck anywhere in the pathway. Right ventricle is also fine. As soon as this right ventricle gives blood to pulmonary vasculature for oxygenation, from here your pulmonary artery starts, which are initially broader, and as soon as they divide for the segmental and subsegmental branches, depending upon the size of embolus, it is going to stuck. If it is big enough, it might get at the segmental branch. If it is very big enough, it might get at the main pulmonary artery trunk and can lead to massive pulmonary embolism. So your size of embolus will decide where it is going to get stuck in pulmonary vasculature. If it gets stuck in the center or in the starting part in the pulmonary artery, it is going to give rise to your massive thromboembolism. If it gets stuck a little peripheral, not much involving a particular whole segment, it is going to give rise to your submassive pulmonary embolism. But if it is small enough that it has reached your peripheries of lung parenchyma, or it is getting stuck in a small branch, it will lead to your acute small pulmonary thromboembolism, which usually leads to pulmonary infarction. So depending upon the size, it is going to stuck it. Now we'll talk about the source. As we talked that for venous thromboembolism, one more thing we skipped here, but that was paradoxical emboli. As we told that this venous thromboembolism is starting from venous circulation, going towards heart. The pathway is broad, not getting stuck, going towards pulmonary vasculature, getting stuck in pulmonary vasculature. But if somehow I create a communication from this venous side to arterial side, I can send this embolus from venous side to arterial side. And that possibility is mostly common seen in two, where atriums communicate. Suppose right atrium is communicating to left atrium via a patent foramen ovale or a atrial septal defect. The embolus which is received by right atrium can go to left atrium, and from left atrium it can behave like an arterial thrombi now. Like it can get stuck in any of the peripheral organs, leading to ischemia of that particular part. This is known as paradoxical phenomena. Now, we have to talk about the source of emboli. As we already spoke, that it is going to get stuck more or less at the end of the day in pulmonary vasculature. But the origin varies because your venous circulature is coming from the every part. It is coming from upper limb, it is from lower limb, thigh, or pelvic region. So few regions are predisposed or have a propensity more for stasis and the possibility of creation of embolism. So depending upon the predisposing factors and that exact environment which is needed for embolus formation, it is most commonly seen in our lower limb, that is in our calf muscles. So our lower limb DVT is 10 times more common than upper limb DVT. Upper limb DVTs are also seen and they can be responsible for pulmonary vascular thromboembolism, which have very selected cases. But when it comes to most common phenomenon, it is usually the deep venous thrombosis of lower limb, that is calf muscles residing the deep vein. They show this phenomena. So what is this particularity about this lower limbs or the deep veins which are residing below the calf muscles, which increases the possibility of origin of emboli from that particular source? It comes from the Virchow's triad, which is told that the possibility of any emboli formation starts from three possibilities. One is stasis of the blood. As we know, the God has made our body in circulation in a way that at rest or at normal phenomena, at nowhere, neither too much hypercoagulity is happening, neither too much bleeding is happening. There is a particular balance which is maintained in our body. But this Virchow triad shows that it at three abnormalities, there's a possibility of emboli formation. One is our hypercoagulability. Second is our venous stasis. Third is endothelial injury. Any one of these three can be a trigger point for the formation of emboli. If there is too much stasis in the venous blood, as it is shown in bedridden state, hemiparesis, hemiplegia, prolonged bedridden stays, post-surgery stays, prolonged cast, all these things, long airway travel. So all these are the predisposing factors for stasis. Then it comes your hypercoagulability, which is seen in particular mutation states, particular pro-inflammatory states, and also endothelial injury, which is usually secondary to trauma or surgery. So any of these balance getting disturbed starts your emboli formation. So as soon as emboli formation starts, it is usually start by the accumulation of platelet, and we all, as all know, platelet activation and aggregation follows along with the thrombin network, and then this thrombus is formed, which is a venous thrombus, which is totally different from arterial thrombus. And venous thrombi, they have a tendency to get dislodged as well. Now, this thrombi has a local phenomena as soon as it is going to get stuck somewhere, and it has a chemical nature also. Before that, we'll discuss the possibilities of risk factors which can lead to DVT. As you all know, DVT will be the pre-step which has to go for pulmonary thromboembolism. Directly, pulmonary thromboembolism cannot happen. The emboli has to generate somewhere, then it get to stuck at pulmonary vasculature. So generation, as we told, the three imbalance of triad, which usually seen. First, we talk about two possible mutation. As we all know, in our body, protein C, protein S, and antithrombin, they are God-given anticoagulants which are there in body, which keeps the balance on one side, and the other side there are coagulation nature particles. So factor Leiden 5 mutation and prothrombin mutation, these are the two possible mutation which can increase the hypercoagulability of the body and can predispose for embolism. There are genetic deficiencies of protein C, protein S also, but it is usually seen very rarely. But there is a major chunk of risk factors which predispose for the majority of things as we discussed. It could be cancer, it could be hemiparesis, plegia, prolonged cast, bedridden state, OCPs containing estrogen, surgery, post-surgery, trauma. So these are the risk factors along with that hypercoagulability state or action alone can lead to emboli formation. Now this emboli formation, it is in deep vein. From this deep vein of calf muscles or anywhere, it usually starts in the calf muscles. From calf muscle, as soon as one emboli is formed, it keeps on extending as soon as the emboli size is increasing. It can involve your calf muscles, it can extend up to your popliteal vein, femoral vein, it can go up to iliac vein also. So your whole leg can get involved as well in DVT. So depending upon the size, as soon as it gets dislodged, it is going to get stuck in pulmonary vasculature. So now we discussed about the source of emboli. Now we are going to discuss as soon as this emboli is getting dislodged from here and going to pulmonary vasculature, depending upon the size and where it is going to get stuck, it is going to cause different kind of symptoms, different kind of clinical features. Now, first, if you assume that the emboli is big enough, so as soon as you send the emboli to pulmonary vasculature, you imagine at pulmonary artery bifurcation or at the very second step, it gets stuck. As soon as it gets stuck, what it is going to do, that the blood is coming from right atrium to right ventricle, and right ventricle blood is going towards pulmonary vasculature for oxygenation. But now there is a huge obstruction in form of this emboli. So what is going to happen? It is going to give some resistance. So this pulmonary pathway resistance is going to create this blood is not able to go for oxygenation. If this blood is not going to go for oxygenation, your circulation is getting affected. So there will be hypoxemia because this blood is not able to reach pulmonary vasculature for oxygenation. Now, as soon as this blood is not able to go, this right ventricle has to accommodate this extra amount of blood, which will lead to your right ventricle distension. Now, this right ventricle distension has to give blood to someone and or to push somewhere. So this right ventricle, as soon as it gets distended or dilated, it is going to do back pressure towards the right atrium also, which is going to be the starting point of right-sided heart failure. As soon as RV dilatation started to send blood to right atrium, to vena cavas, jugulars, and all the story of right-sided heart failure. And this, because it is acute condition, sometimes the body and heart and valves does not get the time enough to accommodate for the situation. So this sudden dilatation sometimes pushes the right ventricle towards left ventricle also. As we all know, there is an interventricular septum. So as soon as this right ventricle suddenly get dilated, this pushes the interventricular septum and it bulges into the left ventricle also. Now left ventricle per se has no abnormality, no ischemia, no problem it is happening in L ventricle. But because of this bulging, its volume gets compromised. And because its volume gets compromised, it is going to affect it in two. One is it is going to have diastolic dysfunction. It is not going to properly diastole because it has to receive blood from upstairs, and it is going, because of this diastole dysfunction, its cardiac output decreases. So depending upon the location of thrombus, if it is big enough to cause RV dilatation, it is going to lead to right-sided heart failure. And if it is big enough to cause RV distension, it is going to bulge towards left ventricle to cause diastolic dysfunction and hence fall in cardiac output. This is the massive condition. Emboli, massive enough. So massive thrombopulmonary embolism getting obstructed at the junction of pulmonary artery, causing dilatation, right-sided heart failure, and your LV diastolic dysfunction and your LV failure, that is leading to decreased cardiac output. So it is going to go in acute cardiogenic shock. So this was the worst of the worst possibilities which can happen in pulmonary thromboembolism. As soon as I locate this emboli a little peripheral, so I am letting few pulmonary artery go for oxygenation. I have obstructed a segmental artery. Now at this stage also, a big portion is compromised. Blood is not going there. So at that point, oxygenation is compromised. But this resistance is not big enough to cause airway distension because some amount of blood is still going supposed to upper lobe or to lower lobe, but it is not going to middle lobe. So there is resistance, but it is not severe enough to cause RV dilatation and etc. That is happens in only severe form. But what will happen? Because oxygenation is compromised, there is going to be dyspnea, there is going to be chest pain if there is severe pulmonary embolism. If there is severe pulmonary embolism, because of decreased cardiac output, there could be syncope, decreased urine output. These are the components of severe pulmonary embolism: your chest pain, tachycardia, dyspnea, near syncope, and cyanosis. Because the amount of compromise is huge. But when you make it submassive or segmental pulmonary thromboembolism, some amount of blood is still reaching, so you can rule out syncope. Chest pain will be less, but still dyspnea will be there, or exertional dyspnea will be there, depending upon the amount of compromise. Actually, the reason of dyspnea here is very particular. One, you can say that blood is not reaching for oxygenation. Your blood is not reaching for oxygenation, so in that area, perfusion compromise is there because your blood is not reaching. Your air is coming from the top to the lung parenchyma, but blood is not reaching. So there is perfusion compromise. When you see the rest of the parenchyma where perfusion is normal, and it is going extra because this area is not perfused, so because of that collaterals, extra blood goes to the normal lung parenchyma. But that normal lung parenchyma has limited oxygen. Their blood is more, but relatively oxygen is less. So because of this VQ mismatch, because of that ventilation and your perfusion mismatch, this oxygen gradient is disturbed, because which the area which is receiving good oxygen, it has less blood reaching to it, and the area and vice versa, which has good blood, it has less oxygen to receive to it. So because of this mismatch, there is progressive dyspnea. Now, if you locate it the most periphery and only a small part is compromised, suppose at the periphery, it is just lead to pulmonary infarction. A small part of pulmonary vasculature will go into infarction because of this lack of blood supply, but it will lead to dyspnea, but it is usually exertional dyspnea. There won't be much tachycardia, there won't be right-sided heart failure. And sometimes because of these different grades of pulmonary thromboembolism, its clinical presentation varies from a acutely deterioration cardiogenic shock patient, from a patient who is just coming with exertional dyspnea, which could be your chronic pulmonary thromboembolism. So because of this wide possibility of clinical features, is a lot, and there were limited clinical findings also, which makes the diagnosis of pulmonary thromboembolism a little difficult. And because we are always looking for those clinical features which mimic this condition, and we are always looking in the wrong direction. Probably we are looking for myocardial infarction. Probably as soon as we see breathlessness, we are looking for respiratory causes or COPD or asthma attack. So that's the reason, because of this not so classical presentation, and because of the other conditions which are very famous also, and they mimic this condition. There's a possibility that diagnosis of pulmonary thromboembolism get hidden between these
So then how will you
conditions.
differentiate the chest pain of MI and chest pain of pulmonary embolism?
See, there are few conditions that at there are first history is going to be very important. Now, in pulmonary thromboembolism, the presentation can be acute also, but the presentation can be chronic also. At one side, you have myocardial chest pain, which has your typical angina presentation, atypical angina presentation, and angina equivalents. So on one side, myocardial angina is altogether different entity to differentiate. But when the comparison comes between myocardial infarction chest pain or be it any other chest pain or breathlessness, and one on one side pulmonary thromboembolism, chest pain and breathlessness, along with your history support and clinical features, there are one or two very important bedside investigations or quick investigations which are going to help you a lot along with the clinical examination. Suppose, for example, when you're taking your clinical examination history, all the risk factors we discussed, they are not so predisposing for MI or COPD. They are more disposed towards pulmonary thromboembolism, as your recent trauma, travel, surgery, OCPs, all the risk factors which we discussed, they point a little towards pulmonary thromboembolism. As soon as just you are hearing the symptom of the patient, you have not even touched the patient. So depending upon the storyline, there might be a little inclination towards your pulmonary thromboembolism. It might be depending a little inclination towards MI or COPD, depending upon their history of diabetic, hypertensive, metabolic syndrome, and all other. But we should know that in both the cases, age overlap is there, and risk factors like dyslipidemia, smoking, they can predispose to any of these conditions. So there will be a gray zone when it comes to clinical history and clinical examination. That's why you need few quick bedside investigations, which will help you to differentiate. And there are a few short investigations also, which you quickly can jump onto, take a final call before you are having a high likely chance of looking at a DVT possibility or your pulmonary thromboembolism. So depending upon that, it will be ideal if we briefly discuss the diagnostic part of pulmonary thromboembolism. So when we are aware about the presentation of the patient, we are aware about the possible risk factors of the patient. The patient is in front of you with the presentation mimicking all these conditions. When it comes to mimicking conditions, suppose DVT can be mimicking your cellulitis, post-thrombotic syndrome, rupture of Baker's, etc. That is pulmonary embolism you are more worried about, because if it is small pulmonary embolism, it can present like pneumonia also. If it just breathlessness, it can mimic your bronchial asthma, it can mimic your COPD. If there is pleuritic type of chest pain, it can mimic your viral syndrome, costochondritis, and pleurisy. So these are the mimicking and your acute coronary syndrome of this, and even anxiety bout can also mimic in a young age patient. Complain of chest tightness, they can complain of acute exacerbation of breathlessness, palpitation, which can very well clinically embolism. So these are the possible list of conditions which has a possibility of mimicking your pulmonary thromboembolism. So as soon as your clinical features get completed, there are two very quick investigations, which are ECG and chest X-ray. On further radio imaging like CT scans, contrast are very well there, and they're good evidence also. But as soon as we start with chest X-ray and ECG, there are two big benefits with these conditions. If you, as soon as you get a ECG done, there are 80 to 90% of possibility can short rule out your acute coronary syndrome, as you can be sure that this is not MI or this is MI. Pericarditis are mostly visible on ECG. So these are two conditions which can very well be ruled out on ECG. And ECG has few links towards your pulmonary thromboembolism depending upon the grade. There is one very famous presentation on ECG that is known as Q333. It is very specific for pulmonary thromboembolism, but it has not very much sensitivity. 20 to 25% is percentage of patients is going to show that classical presentation of S1QT33. So you mind, but just because that presentation on ECG is not that you can't rule out pulmonary thromboembolism. So that's why look is because clinically you know that in severe cases RV dilatation is happening. As soon as RV dilatation is happening, RV is under strain, it is expanding a lot. So there is a possibility of RV ischemia, RV strain pattern, which is usually seen by T wave inversion in anterior leads like V12, or your RV strain pattern by deep ST depression curve. So what you are searching for ECG is RV phenomena or RV strain pattern. These are the possibilities of looking into the ECG, because there is going to be your hypertension associated with right ventricular strain. Sometimes what will happen that RV strain or dilatation is this much significant enough that right coronary artery is going above it. And this blood flow also get compromised because of the significant, if right coronary blood supply is getting significantly compromised, it can lead to RV infarction also, which is also very, in the case of RV microinfarction, your serum enzymes are going to come positive, which can again confuse you with MI. Because MI, as soon as biomarkers are positive, like troponin and I, you will think of MI. So before we go on to Excel, there is one important thing about clinical examination, which can very well be helpful between differentiating your be it pericarditis or your MI when it compared to thromboembolism. And that important thing is clinical findings of pulmonary hypertension or your RV-sided heart failure. There's a possibility of RV failure there also, but one classical finding of pulmonary hypertension, which is going to be seen in pulmonary embolism, which might not be there in MI. Because as soon as right sided is getting dilated and your pulmonary hypertension is there could be possibility of heave near the sternum over the left sided sternal border of RV ventricular heave could be there, and there could be loud S2 because of your loud P2 could be there. That is a component and important clinical finding because of pulmonary hypertension. So these are two important clinical findings that if we are eagle's eye enough, we can pick those findings on clinical examination, which will give you a clinical clue of right-sided failure or basically pulmonary hypertension. Now, this pulmonary hypertension, is it because of pulmonary thromboembolism or not? We have to find it on a later stage. So now when we came to your X-ray findings, your X-ray findings are going to help in two ways, because there are few clinical findings, few X-ray findings which are seen in pulmonary embolism, and there are few findings which are going to enlighten about other diseases which could be there in lung parenchyma. Because when you are taking an X-ray, you can cover lung parenchyma, which are going to give hint about respiratory conditions. Your COPD, emphysema, such kind of presentations can be seen on chest X-ray. So it is going to give clue about other respiratory conditions. Again, you're going to help out in your differential diagnosis, pneumonia, etc. And there are few types of X-ray findings which are classical or more related to our pulmonary thromboembolism. One, as soon as you saw that there could be dilatation of right ventricle, so you can compare by your ratio that right ventricle is dilated on chest X-ray. Now, depending upon how much part is involved, if I compromise significant part of pulmonary artery, there will be fading or oligemic appearance in a particular part. Because a particular part, if it does not receive proper blood supply, there will be reduced blood supply in a particular area, which will be known as oligemic lung area. So that is one possible finding. Second, what?
Westermarck sign.
Yeah, correct. Westermarck sign. So this particular oligemic appearance could be there. As soon as you move towards the periphery of the lung parenchyma, if it is a very small emboli which is get stuck at the peripheral vasculature, if it is get stuck there, it can cause your infarction. Now this infarction, because of blood and hemocytin, etc., it can give a wedge-shaped appearance at the periphery of the lung vasculature. That is your second sign. And third possibility will be there if the pulmonary embolism has taken decent amount of time to stay there. So if emboli stay at a particular pulmonary artery for a long enough time, because of the collection of blood, your pulmonary artery trunk gets dilated. So when you see in an X-ray, as soon as pulmonary trunk come out opposite to the lung parenchyma, you can see a very nicely dilated and engorged pulmonary trunk, which can be nicely visible in pulmonary embolism, but it has nothing to do with your MI. So there are a few, there could be effusion also in cases of small massive pulmonary embolism. So there are a few specific and non-specific signs which enlighten about the possibility of pulmonary embolism, simultaneously give important clues about other respiratory conditions which could be there, be it COPD, asthma, lobar pneumonia, pleurisy, rib fracture, pneumothorax, especially, etc. So at the same time, you can do two kind of approaches. But before you approach, see, chest X-ray and ECG are going to be your like a protocol thing. You have to get them because all the conditions which fall in such presentation have to be ruled out with these investigations. Now, further approach has to be decided depending how clinically you are, how much clinically you are suspecting your pulmonary thromboembolism. Either you are suspecting as a low risk or moderate risk or high risk, depending upon your presentation, his risk factors and other things. So there is a Wells criteria or a Wells scoring system, which is there for DVT also, and which is there for pulmonary embolism. Depending upon plus minus and depending on the total score, you can calculate that whether it is a high risk patient or high chances of a pulmonary embolism, whether it's a low risk. For high risk patient, you don't have to waste time in other investigation. You can directly go for confirmatory investigation, that is radio imaging. And when there is low risk, but there is still a risk, you can go for a rule out test, that is a blood test, which we'll discuss about. And if your blood test is showing some signs, go for confirmatory radio imaging. If your rule out test is showing no signs, you can stop right in there and you can exclude your diagnosis of pulmonary thromboembolism. So we are going to talk about that rule out test, or that blood test, which is very famous because of COVID right now, that is D-dimer.
D-dimer.
Actually, the D-dimer because becomes famous, but it has no specificity. The problem is no specificity, but the good thing is it's very efficient sensitivity. It becomes famous in the COVID phenomena also because it tells the thrombotic state, how much inflammatory state or thrombotic state is going in the body. That intensity is very well told by D-dimer, hence it has become very famous now also. Previously, or even now also, when we are using for pulmonary thromboembolism, we are using it as a rule out test. By rule out test, I mean if it is positive, suspect highly, but you can't be sure of. But if it is negative, you can rule out pulmonary embolism by 95%. Because if D-dimer is negative in a patient, you are suspecting pulmonary embolism, 95% chances are there the patient is not having pulmonary embolism. The sensitivity falls to 80% when it comes to DVT, because DVT is a small embolus, pulmonary embolism is big enough. So it is used as rule out, but not confirmatory. Not confirmatory because it has low specificity. Because if a patient is having D-dimer positive, it could be positive in sepsis, it could be positive in pneumonia, it could be positive in MI. You have seen sepsis of COVID also, it has D-dimer positive there also. So because of other possibilities which has D-dimer positivity, the D-dimer specificity is very low, and it is used as a rule out method. That if it is there, go ahead with the search of diagnosis. If it is negative, you can check the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism then and there, and you can search for other possible diagnoses. And this is the reason D-dimer is used as a rule out test. The reason of D-dimer being elevated is because it is an end product of fibrin. And as soon as the emboli is formed in the body, our body tries to break it down. And when the body itself is trying to break down the fibrin, the D-dimer is released. So actually, D-dimer is a sign of ineffective thrombolysis going in the body, because it is not able to leave us, but ineffective thrombolysis is going in the body on our own body mechanism, which is giving indirect evidence in the form of raised D-dimer. So suppose raised D-dimer is present, then we can directly jump on to few radio imaging evidences, which will search for your diagnosis. Now there are two things. Now there are two things. One, source of emboli. Second, where is it stuck at? Source of emboli, as we have seen, mostly it is going to be DVT. Second, the position where it is stuck at is pulmonary vasculature. Briefly, we'll tell about DVT. Because it is stuck at DVT, the cheapest and very effective method is your Doppler ultrasonography of the deep veins. Because there is a loss of compressibility from the probe when there will be thrombus lodged into the deep veins. There won't be bidirectional flow. There won't be change of flow along with respiration. There will be Doppler changes. So there are many signs by which this cheap, sensitive bedside investigation can be ruled out. So your Doppler USG study of lower limb, it is a very effective way to look for DVT. There will be local changes also. Also, just because you have not found a thrombus in the lower limb does not mean it was not there. If there was a small thrombus who has already dislodged and went to the pulmonary vasculature, now you are looking for thrombus, it could be there, a small leftover part or one more thrombus, and it could not be there because it is already dislodged to the pulmonary vasculature. So it is a method, but again, can't be short of. But we'll more focus about pulmonary vasculature, because as we discussed, it is stuck somewhere in the pulmonary vasculature. The radio imaging, which is going to give you a short everything, is going to be CT scan, and not the normal CT scan. We have to use contrast enhanced CT scan. Contrast enhanced CT scan, because as we are following the blood, the contrast will also follow the blood, and the particular location where blood is getting stopped, their contrast will also get stopped also. So not only contrast will tell the location of the pulmonary thrombus, it will tell the area which has been compromised. It can directly comment whether the thromboembolism is massive, submassive, or acute, whether it is associated infarction is there or not. So there are a lot of details which are disclosed by contrast enhanced CT scan. So there are two things when it comes to CCT that we are to be careful about. One is your contrast sensitivity or allergic history, and second, will be compromised renal function, which is going to be get affected or excretion. So other than these, there are no contraindications for it, and it is a brilliant method to find out the pulmonary embolism, source size also, and other conditions of lung parenchyma, which you can see and comment also. So after this CT, there will be old methods which were now discarded, but now we are only follow CCT scanning. One more thing is when we were talking about that ventilation scan, perfusion scan, and lung scanning. And lung scanning, other than contrast, we use albumin infusion, and albumin is attached with the radioisotope. And along with that, the same pattern is formed with the way it is formed in contrast. but only the albumin infusion is not going to be allergic and there won't be any problem of excretion also. That is a safe method. And your what ventilation and perfusion scans are used. Your ventilation scan is a good scan, but there is a only one problem, because in ventilation scan you're checking if any ventilatory compromise is there or not. So suppose if I suffer from pulmonary embolism, and if a 60-year-old suffer from pulmonary embolism, when you do my ventilatory scan and there is a no old lung pathology, no old COPD, no history of asthma, no history of smoking, so basically there is no old compromise of ventilation. So my scan will be a true evidence of what pulmonary embolism has caused. But in a 60-year-old patient who's a known COPD since 5 years, who's a heavy smoker since 25 years, in that his ventilation is already compromised because of his old etiology, lung etiology. So in that you won't be accurately able to differentiate whether that compromise of ventilation is either because of pulmonary embolism or your old respiratory etiology. So that one, it is going to be a problem. Otherwise, you can be used very successfully. One important method which now is being used, not because of a direct evidence, more of an indirect evidence, and that is echocardiography. That one more important method is 2D echocardiography. So in 2D echocardiography, because you're seeing just the chambers, one more thing I reminded from the chambers, that in CT scan, you can see the size of the chambers also. So at that point, it is going to get comment on right ventricle size also, that whether your right-sided heart failure has started or not. In the CT scan, you can comment that also. But when it comes to 2D echocardiography, it has the importance of indirect evidence and to rule out few things rather than direct evidence of pulmonary embolism, because pulmonary embolism is there in pulmonary vasculature. When you do 2D echo, you can't see pulmonary vasculature, but you can see the consequences. Same, your RV-sided heart failure, pulmonary artery hypertension by the pressure management, RV dilatation, regurgitation, bulge of IV septum. These all indirect evidence of pulmonary embolism you can see in 2D echocardiography. So one will be your indirect evidence. Second possibility is because you are thinking continuously of cardiac tamponade, MI, myocardial infarction, that is ACS. So as soon as you do a 2D echocardiography and there is no regional wall abnormality in any other chambers, you can easily rule out your acute myocardial infarction. So once we have concluded the diagnosis, earlier the better treatment will be very important in pulmonary thromboembolism, because as it is an acute condition, or too much compromise has been happened and hypoxia is going on. So the better we take a step for treatment, the better it is going to be. So treatment approach, it is actually done after risk stratification, and risk stratification can be done as we have seen two important things. One, your RV compromise, that is RV dilatation, and second was cardiogenic shock. None of these things are existing. It is known as low risk condition. If only high RV dilatation is there, but there is no systolic loss in BP, it is moderate. Compromised condition will be there when there is fall in BP, also hypotension along with RV hypokinesia or dilatation. So that is a significant condition. This is your middle condition, your low risk condition. In your low risk condition, as you have seen, that there is no systolic blood pressure loss and there is no RV dilatation. Compromise is not significant. You can go for your anticoagulation therapy, not the thrombolysis, just the anticoagulation therapy. Or if it is a recurrent condition, you can go for IVC filter, which is urgent topic to discuss, that which are the condition which needs IVC filters. But certainly in low risk, when RV dilatation is not there and systolic fall in blood pressure, no need for either thrombosis or any surgical intervention. There is a extreme zone dilatation is also there, that is you are going towards right side heart failure, and along with that systolic fall in BP is there. This is a classic condition which needs immediate attention, immediate intervention, either in the form of thrombolysis with anticoagulation, that you first thrombolize the embolus and continue with anticoagulation, or you can go for your catheter based procedures or surgical procedures or thrombus removal. So this is this extreme zone. There is one middle zone where systolic blood pressure compromise is not there, but still RV is dilated. This is an area of not confusion, area of discussion. We take a subjective call that whether hemodynamic we can take a call on this direction. If not, we can take a call on this direction. So there will be subjective decisions in the middle category, but if the patient is in this category of fallen systolic BP as well as RV dilatation going towards right side heart failure, it has to thrombolysis with anticoagulation or your surgical intervention. It could be catheter mediated or it could be thrombus removal also. So when anticoagulation therapy we discussed, not the thrombolysis, I'm discussing just anticoagulation therapy. And what anticoagulation therapy I'm discussing, it applies for all the three categories. It's going to give the theme. So there was one previously classic approach where we used to do unfractioned heparin or low molecular heparin course. We used to give this course for 5 days. By the time we have started this course, we used to add warfarin in the starting because we know warfarin is going to take time to act around 5 to 7 days. This was known as bridging method, that we are starting your anticoagulation fraction heparin or low molecular weight heparin, simultaneously starting warfarin. After 5 days, you can stop your heparin and you can continue with your warfarin, depending upon the duration of anticoagulation you need. This was the classical approach. Now we have moved forward from this approach also, because there are now two kinds of novel anticoagulants you have. One, which does not need any bridging. So if you have started with either unfractioned heparin or low molecular heparin or fondaparinux or all the newer agent also, if you have given a course of 5 days, there is no need for bridging. You can stop your warfarin, you can introduce your factor 10A inhibitor like dabigatran or any other. They will start their action immediately within the same day. They don't need any bridging, and there are other benefits also, that there are less chances of bleeding. There is no need to monitor any blood investigation like PTINR, FETT, etc. On these drugs, although they're more on the expensive side. So at the moment, you have to do a patient selection also, because you can't let the patient miss this drug. So for affordability, you can still go for warfarin better than these expensive drugs. But if patient is affordable, you can very well go on this newer agent also. So this was the second approach, when you are starting with unfractioned or low molecular weight heparin or your fondaparinux or such agents. After 5 days, shifting on to that agent, which is oral factor 10A inhibitor, does not need any bridging, does not need any monitoring, and you can continue for whatever duration is required. 3 months, 6 months, lifelong. This is also very subjective depending upon the case. The third newer method which has come, which has totally ruled out the parental anticoagulation. Now we have such drugs also that from the day one also you can use them as the monotherapy. From monotherapy, I mean they are only going to lyse the embolus or thrombus, and they are going also only going to prevent the further anticoagulation in the further. One example is apixaban. So these drug, one more drug is there. So these drug we will use in a loading dose. So their dose will be higher. Suppose for 1 week we'll use it on a higher dose. Still the drug is going to be oral only. So for 1 week you will use on a higher dose. After 1 week you will use at a maintenance dose till whatever time of period you want it to use. So one classical method was low molecular or unfractioned heparin 5 days, overlapping bridging with warfarin, then only warfarin. Second method now does not need any bridging. You start with unfractioned or low molecular weight heparin on fondaparinux or dipitravir or any other agent which have been now become available. After 5 days, you can shift on to factor 10A inhibitor, like for example, dabigatran. No need of monitoring, a little expensive, no need of bridging, and you can continue. Third, the newest approach, no need of parental anticoagulation. I'm not saying the third approach is superior to second approach. It is just available. So the third approach is from the day one, you can start with monotherapy of oral anticoagulant, which is itself going to lyse the embolus also. So depending upon 1 week or 3 week of high dose regime, after you can shift on the maintenance dose and you can continue till whatever time you want the anticoagulation. Now, why I'm telling there is varying amount of anticoagulation, because for DVT it is different, for pulmonary embolism it is different, for provoked is different, for provoked DVT pulmonary embolism it is different. And if any risk factor is coexisting, even I am 6 months you have to give the drug. Suppose a bedridden patient is there. Suppose a cancer suffering patient is there. Suppose a high inflammatory psoriasis patient is there. So if the condition which led to this thing, it is existing there, you have to continue anticoagulation also, irrespective of the duration. In such patient, you have to continue anticoagulation lifetime also. So general rule is, if there was a provocating factor and you have removed it, continue for 3 months. Do not extend more than 6 months. If there was no unprovoked factor, if still it has happened, the rule is, if the risk is if it is idiopathic, few suggest lifetime, if no bleeding risk. If bleeding risk is there, you can use two approach. You give it for 6 to 9 months, then you reduce the dose. As you are maintaining the INR between 2 to 3, now you can maintain your target INR between 1.5 to 2, and you can wait if something worse is happening or not, depending upon the bleeding manifestations are there or not. If all the risk factors have been removed, you can after slowly wane it off after 9 months. So it is very subjective also, and depending upon the underlying condition also. Few conditions like cancer can need long time anticoagulation till the patient becomes cancer free. So this was about the duration of anticoagulation. When we talk about thrombolysis, as we told, thrombolysis is only indicated as of now for conditions which have RV dilatation compromise, that is right-sided heart failure, and hypotension, that is your LV diastolic dysfunction, foreign cardio output, or you can use the word cardiogenic shock. So this amount of hemodynamic stability is the indication for thrombolysis till now. If you ask whether submassive thromboembolism is an indication or not, it is a controversial zone. Few are preferring to go for it, few are preferring not to go for it. It is a risk benefit ratio you have to calculate, because there is a more chance of bleeding risk. If you think benefit is going to be more than the risk, you can take that risk. But for now, if you want to know the absolute indication, it is going to be hemodynamic instability and acute massive pulmonary embolism, where you can go for thrombolysis. So as you have heard about thrombolysis for MI also, the same way it works for pulmonary embolism also. Here your drug of choice is going to be your recombinant tissue plasminogen activator. Here also one is on-label dosing, one is off-label dosing. Usually we go for 100 mg of infusion over a period of 2 hours, because the dose is high, manifestation, intracranial hemorrhage, etc. There is one off-label which is preferred by many physicians. They use 50 mg. So success is almost more or less same, a little less, but bleeding significantly. So again, because to reduce risk significantly, they are ready to compromise the litinol benefit, and they go for 50 dose of infusion over a period of 2 hours. We use either tenecteplase or LTPase for that matter. You are giving this drug systemically for thrombolysis. There is a big list for on which you should go through and make the patient run through all those indications before contraindication of surgery, trauma, old stroke, hypertension, accelerated hypertension. There's a contraindication for thrombolysis. Before submitting the patient for thrombolysis, you should make sure the patient has no contraindication, and then you go for it. Now, the newer method which has become famous, that thrombolysis, it is very simple. The logic, what it is, you do use systemic, you use a drug local. If you use a drug systemic, you need large dose, more chances of side effects. Use a drug locally, it is going to do an action where you want the action to be, and it reduces the dose, so it reduces the effect also. So if I introduce the catheter, I can do a immediate angio also to see the perfect pulmonary angio, which was an older method. Now we don't use it unless you are doing thrombolysis. You introduce the catheter, do angio, map it around the embolism. You can give even 1/4 of the dose. The usually used catheter induced thrombolysis is 20 to 25 mg. So you can imagine your risk has significantly fallen down for any station, and you are doing it locally. It gives one more benefit also, that even if your thrombolysis failed, there are other methods, because you are inside near the embolus. You can do thrombolectomy, you can damage the thrombus, suction thrombus, ultrasounded guided damage of the thrombus. There are many indications which you can there are many which you can do for the catheter mediated damage if your thrombolysis induced by the catheter. So depending upon that method, you can use it. So this was about catheter mediated thromboembolism, which is a newer. And the last and not the least, which we talk about the surgical management, it is not usually used because of this success rate of thrombolysis also, and the drug mediated thrombolysis and catheter mediated access also. Open embolectomy has been used significantly less. If your thrombolysis is also failed and there is persistent hypotension with high amount of surgical risk, you can go for embolectomy also. Or a patient which is having a persistent pulmonary arterial hypertension, not responding to anything, given a significant compromise, in that cases with a higher amount of risk ratio, you can go for surgical management also. That is open management. You have to do open sternotomy and do a bypass and then retrieve your huge embolus, which is going to be a high risk surgery for sure. So for now, if we brief it up, the success lies early detection, early treatment. You always keep a differential diagnosis of pulmonary embolism in your head when you see the risk factor. Even if you don't see the risk factor, just as soon as that presentation comes, just don't think of MI, pericarditis, and COPDs and asthma. There's a picture of pulmonary embolism which we are missing many times, and because of this misdiagnosis and mistreatment, we are diagnosing at a very late stage. So a quick awareness and quick clinical evaluation is important. A small investigation can, just like D-dimer or a sharp U1 X-ray and ECG, can help a lot with ruling out of your clinical picture. And immediate treatment not going to help at the current condition also. And the recurrent of venous thromboembolism can be a major problem as well, because if you don't treat it as time, and even if you treat it also, there's a high recurrence rate also if you don't continue the treatment. So if you have missed the diagnosis at that moment also, it is very important to know the cause, so that you can next time you can take care of it and the recurrence does not happen. For now, the famous treatment is still going to be your anticoagulation on this side. And if hemodynamic instability is there, nice selection of patients for thrombolysis and good selection of patients for catheter induced thrombolysis is still the key. And last but not the least of golden point will be a very perfect use of prophylaxis of DVT. In all the hospitals we have seen, the prophylaxis of DVT is not used most of the times. Before submitting the surgery or after patient coming from the surgery, bedridden patients, orthopedic patients, pelvic surgery patients, cancer patients, inflammatory condition patients, there are so many conditions which needs prophylaxis for DVT. And if we use them on time, we won't see a bad day of pulmonary embolism for that patient. If we don't submit the patient for that, there won't be any kind of consequences which can be permanent also, and even for sure fatal as well.
Okay. So I have some few questions. Kindly. Yes, sir. So suppose first question. Suppose a patient came to you while acute exacerbation of COPD, and after few days is suddenly breathless, and we saw DVT is present in the leg, and then pulmonary embolism occurs. So what is the correlation between the COPD and the pulmonary embolism? Why
See,
it
when it
triggers?
comes to COPD, see, there are two possibilities in it. One, if there is pre-existing COPD, it is already submitting the patient for more compromise. Your respiratory compromise is already there because it is a patient of COPD. Already he is hypoxic, hypercapnic, so respiratory compromise is already there. So his threshold for symptoms is already less. Second, COPD is per se itself a cause of core pulmonale or right-sided heart failure and your pulmonary arterial hypertension. That is the pulmonary arterial hypertension rising from the etiology of lung parenchyma. So that patient might be having already pre-existing pulmonary hypertension or core pulmonale. So that also makes this pre-existing condition a little more susceptible, or you can tell low threshold condition. And along with that, it is a systemic inflammatory condition also, which again increases the hypercoagulability. So more risk factor, and along with an associated low threshold for symptom also, and its progress of disease also makes COPD patient more susceptible for it. And again, at the same time, you can miss the diagnosis also because of the same presentation. Because COPD can nicely present with COPD, right-sided heart failure, core pulmonale, with your raised JVP and right-sided heart failure, and you can easily miss coexisting pulmonary embolism if you don't see through the case well.
Okay. So then, what is the most common vein for DVT which can cause pulmonary embolism?
For DVT, the most common source has to be your deep veins of calf muscle only, because at that point the maximum stasis is there. So maximum the stasis, more is the source. So the originating source has to be deep veins of calf muscle, and that extension can go up to popliteal also, femoral also, and iliac also. One more you should not forget is your pelvic girdle. In many cases, your pelvic girdle in surgical interventions, and because of traumatic condition, your pelvic girdle can be the source of embolism as well.
So then, suppose a patient came to you with dyspnea and chest pain, and the lung fill is normal or minimal. So what can be your differential diagnosis for that?
See, when it comes to a condition of dyspnea and chest pain, there are not very few conditions, but there are few conditions which you have to see when dyspnea comes. The first question arises: the dyspnea is either come from the respiratory issue or the cardiac issue. And as you are commenting that there is a coexisting chest pain also, it somewhat inclines you towards the cardiac condition as well. But it does not make you rule out the conditions of cardiac causes also, or respiratory causes also. So when dyspnea, chest pain, and so failure is there, see, failure is, you have to look for either the presentation is acute, or either it is acute and chronic. If patient is having acute presentation, there won't be any background history. And if it is acute and chronic presentation, there will be a background of symptomatology which has now become worsened all of a sudden because of some precipitating factor. So when you're looking about any case of chest pain and dyspnea, there are few respiratory and cardiac and mixed causes which you should always keep in mind even before touching the patient or asking for the history. Being in cardiac causes of aortic myocardial infarction, pericarditis, your aortic dissection, which can be missed many a times. When it comes to respiratory, your pneumothorax has a tendency of getting missed, your pleuritic chest pain, your pneumothorax, your rib fractures, and for sure your pulmonary thromboembolism. So when your right-sided heart failure is there, you should always, so depending upon the symptoms, these are the possible things you should keep in mind. And if failure is there on clinical examination, you have to finalize that whether it is left-sided heart failure or right-sided heart failure. Suppose if you are saying right-sided heart failure is there, so you have to locate the possibility of right-sided heart failure. See, heart not pumping well could be the source of heart failure, or heart facing some resistance could be the source of heart failure. If right heart not pumping properly could be because of myocardial infarction, pneumothorax compressing, or it could be tamponade or pericarditis. If it is pumping well, but the source of resistance is coming from somewhere else, it could be core pulmonale of COPD or your pulmonary embolism. So when you're looking at the right-sided heart failure, you should be able to locate the possibility of resistance or pressure coming from when it comes to right side.
So if it's a metabolic acidosis, then it can also present the same.
See, when you see in massive pulmonary embolism, there has to be metabolic acidosis. In submassive and mild or small pulmonary embolism, it won't be there. But the compromise of hypoxia has to be significant enough to metabolic acidosis. And metabolic acidosis patient again is going to have breathlessness. So your metabolic acidosis is exclusively for your massive pulmonary embolism, where you, if you do arterial analysis, your arterial PaO2 will be less and PCO2 will be less also, along with metabolic acidosis. So it is exclusive for massive pulmonary embolism because it has to show this much amount of involvement to have metabolic acidosis. In mild to moderate, there won't be any metabolic acidosis because the compromise is not significant.
Okay. So in pulmonary embolism, will it be a type 1 or type 2 respiratory failure?
It has to be a type 1 for sure, because your type 1 respiratory failure is your lack of oxygen. In pulmonary embolism, we have no problem with carbon dioxide. Our issue is oxygen is not reaching to the blood because of that obstruction. Because of that obstruction, that blood is not able to go and get that oxygen, and that oxygen is not able to reach, and that your gradient is not matching. So it is short a type 1 respiratory failure, classic example.
Okay. And sir, if there is a massive pulmonary embolism, so why it will present with hypotension and tachycardia both?
See, massive pulmonary embolism will have hypotension, but not brady. It's going to be tachycardia. So when it comes to a classical triad of pulmonary embolism or massive pulmonary embolism, along with your chest pain, your hypotension and tachycardia are the classical symptoms. And very initially, when we discussed about massive pulmonary embolism, if you follow the flow chart of massive embolism in the pulmonary trunk, leading to resistance and your RV dilatation, as soon as your RV dilates acutely, it is not getting time or adjust, and it ends up pushing your left ventricle. And that left ventricle is pushed because of the bulge in interventricular septum. And as soon as this interventricular septum bulges into the left ventricle, there is diastolic dysfunction. The ventricle does not get enough space to receive blood. If it does not get enough space to receive blood, the diastole volume is low and the pumping amount is also low. So the body goes into, because of decreased cardiac output, it goes into hypotension. And in response to hypotension, there will be reflex tachycardia. And because of hypoxic tachycardia also. So your chest pain, your this thing, breathlessness, hypotension, tachycardia, these are the classical features which will be there. At least your breathlessness, tachycardia, and hypotension will be classical for your massive pulmonary embolism.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for your entire assessment. Thank you, sir.